One of the things that we have to realize as we begin to try to interact with other people from other cultures, there are going to be some big areas that we need to be aware of, but there's a lot of other smaller areas as we'll discuss these things. And what I want to do is spend just a little bit of time talking about some of the areas that has received a lot of research in terms of looking at cultural misunderstandings with people from other cultures. And where I want to start today is with the workplace and some research that's been done by Hofstede. He's a big guy in cultural research. He specifically did work in terms of understanding differences between workers from different countries. And if we really think about who we come into contact with on a day-to-day basis in our everyday life, it is not within our family network or our friend network that we end up interacting with diverse people. Most of the people that we interact with on a day-to-day basis are usually very similar to us. And even when I think about my own family, that's certainly true. If I have people over, if we have friends over, they tend to be sociologists. Ugh, that's spooky to get more than one sociologist in a room. So we tend to interact with people that are very similar to us on a day-to-day basis. Where we end up into contact with people from different cultures is usually in the workplace. As we move into the workplace, we are exposed to a variety of different people. And Gert Hofstede is recognized as one of the leading researchers in understanding cultural differences in the workplace. And I want to talk a little bit about his study. What he did was he interviewed people from a variety of different countries, and in your external links you actually have a link to his web page that will actually go into some of these things. And it's very important for us to recognize that if we begin to interact with a person from a particular culture, they are bringing along with them all of their cultural assumptions. And so when they are interacting with us, they are interacting much like we do, is out of habit rather than understanding that they're in a different place at a different time and therefore different rules might apply. If we find ourselves in a different country, we might make that assumption that our rules and how we do things here in the United States is going to be the case for wherever we go, and we should recognize that that just isn't the case. And Hofstede really did provide us with a model to help us to understand cultural differences, especially in the workplace. And he basically originally identified 4 dimensions that we're going to talk about. And then he later added a 5th dimension to try to explain the increase in the development of the Asian countries, whereas some of the other developing countries just do not take off quite like the Asian countries. And so he added a 5th dimension that talked a little bit about why that happened. Now, his first dimension that he talks about is power distance. And for him, that's the extent to which less powerful members of organizations and groups accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. If we look at the United States, we have what Hofstede would call a low power distance score, because we do not expect and we do not accept inequality in our workplace, at least to the extent of some other countries. And so this becomes a very important distinction in terms of how we work with other people within the organization. If you find yourself in a low power distance country, you would expect a little bit more informality between the people within the organization. You might even get asked about your opinions on how to accomplish things. And so it's really more of egalitarian type of assumption as we look at power distance. So basically when we're talking about power distance, we are really asking, what is the society's level of inequality that is accepted by the followers as much as the leaders? All societies will exhibit inequalities, but some societies are more equal and it is more accepting than in other countries. I think of my experience in Barbados when I went down to Barbados and wanted to help the household help with cooking. And she did not want me in that kitchen because that was her domain, and she thought that I was interfering, and she accepted what her position and her status was within that household, and she was okay with that. She didn't want to be equal, and she didn't want to share in her responsibilities because I didn't know what I was doing. So it's a real important distinction as we move from a high power distance to a low power distance culture, and to see the differences in those. And we're certainly going to explore these a little bit more on the discussion board as we go throughout the course. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which is the distinction between individualism versus collectivism. And this is really the degree to which individuals are integrated into groups. And if we look at an individualistic society, the ties between individuals is relatively loose. And they tend to look after themselves and maybe their immediate family. So you have a very loose network within individualistic societies. Where in the collectivist societies, they are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups. They will have more of an extended family network, and they have unquestioning loyalty to that group. So that's the difference between the individualistic and the collectivist. And we are going to spend more time on this dimension because this is one that seems to have a lot of impact in terms of the way that we communicate as well as we interact. The next dimension that Hofstede talks about is the masculinity versus femininity dimension. And this is the distribution of roles between the sexes, and how much a woman's values differ. Well, Hofstede suggested that when we look at all societies and how women operate, there's less differences between the societies in terms of how we assume women will operate versus how we assume the males will operate. So when he's looking, we see a lot more variation in terms of the male values, where male values might be in one particular country very assertive and competitive, and so they're maximally different than the female values of cooperation and modesty, caring, and so on. But there's also some cultures where the males are modest, caring, and they're more similar to the women's values. So they would be considered more of a feminine culture versus a masculine culture. And again, if we're being assertive and competitive versus modest and caring and nicey nice and not wanting any conflict, there's real differences in the way the two societies will operate, in the way that the two societies might come in together to do business. So it's important for us to realize that when we look at women values from society to society to society, they're a lot less different than when we look at male values from society to society to society. And if we're thinking about the way that men do business, because generally that men are the ones that do business, then we need to make that distinction between those countries that might focus more on the competitive aggressiveness versus the ones that are more modest and caring in the way that they carry out their business. The fourth dimension that we have is what's referred to as uncertainty avoidance. And this is the tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity within a culture. It's the degree to which a society socializes its member to be comfortable or uncomfortable in unstructured situations. And by unstructured situations, I'm talking about novel, unknown, surprising, or different from the usual. And obviously here in the United States, we're not afraid of uncertainty. We are socialized to deal with novel situations. We are socialized to deal with the unknown and to try to think out of the box when we run into an unusual situation. Uncertainty avoiding societies minimized unstructured situations by having very strict laws. They have very strict safety and security measures, and they might have philosophically or religiously held beliefs about an absolute truth. So there isn't much variation. It's very tight community. Everybody has an absolute truth, and they are operating by that. You look at some of the Arab countries, and you would find a lot of this type of uncertainty avoidance within that society. People are much more emotional and motivated by inner nervous energy within the uncertainty avoiding countries. The uncertainty accepting societies are more tolerant to different opinions. They try to have fewer rules, and you might see a lot more diversity in terms of philosophical and religious beliefs. So you have many beliefs existing side by side. People tend to be a little bit more self-possessed in these countries, calm, composed. They'll reflect, and they seem to less likely to express emotion. So if you think about the United States, we're not as emotional, some days anyway, as other people. And the final dimension, the one that Hofstede added a little bit later after he analyzed additional data, was this idea of long-term versus short-term orientation. And this is the idea of virtue regardless of truth. So if we have a long-term orientation, people within these cultures will tend towards thrift and perseverance, and those with a short-term orientation have more of a respect for tradition, and they fulfill their social obligations and protect their faith. So some things to think about, and as you're preparing for your final paper, or your presentation anyway, you might be looking at some of these ideas as they relate to different cultures and trying to understand how they might do business depending on those dimensions. A second area that a lot of people talk extensively about is our time and space orientation, and we've talked a little bit about this as we talked about Edward T. Hall earlier in the quarter, where temporality and territoriality were very much discussed. As we'll begin with the space idea. Remember, when we talk about the way that we orient ourselves in space is culturally determined. We are very territorial creatures, just like almost any other animal in the kingdom that I know of. But when we think about the comfortable distances that people keep between themselves, when we look from society to society, it remains relatively constant among members. But these comfortable differences can differ immensely among cultural groups. So, if we look at some of our assumptions about space, for example, and we look at European Americans, we can talk about how much distance we have for different types of tasks. For example, our intimate distance might be body contact to 18 inches. And this intimate distance is what we might do with lovemaking, when we're comforting someone, or when we're whispering. And if you get out a ruler, which I would recommend you do, you can see that 18 inches is not that much. So we're relatively close when we're at 18 inches. Our personal distance is between 18 inches to 4 feet, and this is for our personal to casual conversations. And I always stretch out my arms because they're about 18 inches, and that's certainly as close as I want anybody to come to me for personal or casual conversations. You'll find that sometimes people come in closer than that, and a lot of times what you'll find yourself doing is, if you're not comfortable with how close they are, you end up taking a foot back. You'll step back, and then they might step forward, and then you step back again. And so there's this nice little walk down the hallway as you're trying to maintain your own personal distance with that other individual. So 18 inches to 4 feet. These are things that we can actually observe within our environment and make adjustments to. Usually people give us clues, if we're watching, on how comfortable they are standing next to us for a personal conversation. And you can usually let the other person take the lead. Our social distance is 4 to 8 feet, and these are for our formal interactions. And if we look at how a normal classroom would be set up, you have at least 4 feet between where the desks are arranged to where the professor stands. And our public distance would be 12 to 15 feet, and these are for our public lectures and for performances. And if you think about an auditorium that has a stage set up, and then they have a little bit of room in front before the seat starts, usually that's about 12 to 25 feet. Average conversational distances, that is, if we're entering into a conversation, for European Americans, it's about 20 inches. So about an arm's length is exactly what you're looking at, unless you have extra long arms, but generally about 20 inches. For Latinos, it's 14 to 15 inches. And for Arabic-based countries, it's 9 to 10 inches. And if you recall, Our intimate distance, I do believe, is 9 to 10 inches. What is it? Body contact to 18 inches. So the Arabic countries are a lot closer, are always in our intimate space, a lot more than what we might prefer. And it becomes important for us to understand that these space differences exist. Again, you can observe these as you watch people interact in different countries. And so we need to be aware that sometimes when we don't want to stand closer than 18 inches or 20 inches to have a conversation, we might be labeled as cold, uptight, unfriendly. And sometimes when we enter into conversations with Latinos or people from Arabic cultures, we might find them to be standing too close, invading our impersonal space, being aggressive, getting in our space, invading our territory, and so on and so forth. I can remember my mother. We had a neighbor who was from Cuba, and I can remember my mother didn't like to talk to her face to face because she stood too close, and it drove my mother crazy. And if she would have known that she was, well, she did know that she was Cuban, but she didn't realize that there's different space assumptions depending on cultural differences in that. I knew that, but she didn't know that, and it was fun to watch her go crazy because of that. Okay. And sometimes the way that they classify our space is in terms of sensory exposure. And if we have high sensory exposure, that's a higher need for contact. Cultures that have that more high sensory exposure would be the French, the Italians, Latino, Russians, Arabs, and Africans. People with more of a moderate sensory exposure, which means that we can deal with a little bit of contact with one another, would be our U.S. Americans, Canadians, Northern Europeans, Australians, Germans, and Danes. And those people with a low sensory exposure would be East Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, where you don't find a lot of body contact. So these are some of our space differences. It's something to keep in mind as you're interacting with other people and to observe it in other people. Okay, another idea here is that time, again, like our space, isn't necessarily innate to us. In other words, we are not born into this world with an idea of time. Babies tend to go from event to event, like I'm hungry and feed me, and I don't care what time it is. And so each and every culture trains their people in terms of time understandings and how are we going to look at time. And when we look at the working unit of time for European Americans and Europeans, it's usually the 5-minute block. And so when we think about being late, we think in terms of 5-minute blocks. So if a person is 5 minutes late, then that's probably okay. If they're 10 minutes late, we begin to get irritated because they're late. If they become 15 minutes late, then we expect them to give us a call or something to let us know that they're going to be late. And when we think about this 5-minute block, I always say, if you don't believe that we have this 5-minute block, think about if you have a date and the date is 1 minute late, just leaving and not waiting. And I guarantee you will be the one that is considered wrong because you didn't wait 5 minutes until they showed up. So it's real important for us to remember that this is sort of set in our culture. We can get irritated, and we get irritated with people that don't have that idea about the 5-minute block. Even when we go to the doctor's office, you can see that 5-minute block operating. Usually you're sitting out in the waiting room for 15 minutes, and then they'll introduce you into one of the examination rooms for 15 minutes. The doctor might walk in for 5 minutes, walk back out for another 10 minutes, and then come back in and finish up with you. So we are operating in that 5-minute time block. Other cultures do not place the same emphasis on this 5-minute time. If we look at, again, a lot of the Arabic countries, it's about 15 minutes. And so if you think about us, so after 15 minutes you might be getting into trouble. For them it would be after 45 minutes. So that's a big difference when you think about how much time is spent waiting for people. And sometimes when you're working with more Arabic-oriented people, you will find that they might just show up. You know, if you have a party, it might be that they come 2 hours late. So I know when I set up a dinner party, I expect people to be there on time because I've got that nice German heritage, and therefore when I say 6 o'clock, I mean 6 o'clock. So I even have to work at being fashionably late because I tend to be 10 to 15 minutes early to most parties I end up going to because I don't want to be late. But my husband's the same way, luckily, so we don't have much time misunderstandings between us, but that's a good thing. So we end up driving around a lot when we have to go to a party or an event until we are fashionably late. Europeans and U.S. citizens are also much more present and future-oriented than a lot of other cultures who are more past-oriented. Again, if we think about the Arabs and the Arabic cultures, they are much more past-oriented. And this means that they are looking back and they recognize events of the past and actually how they influence their behaviors now. And sometimes we don't get that here in the United States, that we're very present, we're very future-oriented, we're not looking back at our past mistakes, and that's why the United States ends up making the same mistakes over and over and over again. So hopefully one day that we'll learn that we need to pay attention to our past and our past relationships with other cultures, and sometimes we would probably find what the cause of the problem and the conflict is. We also have some cultures where time consists of a series of events. I've sort of suggested that when we talk about a baby. When a baby is born, it's a series of events from one meal to the next meal and maybe one diaper to the next diaper. But for other cultures, we still have some other, like Native American cultures, where time consists of a series of events, and it's usually related to changes in the seasons, for example. And so we have to remember that time isn't always imagined in terms of a 24-hour clock. We can make a distinction between two types when we're looking at time misunderstandings. We can look at the monochronic cultures where they pay attention to the clock and they do one thing at a time. These countries might include, again, a lot of the European countries, the United States, Germany, Switzerland, Great Britain, Sweden, the Netherlands. All of those countries are more monochronic, where we're always paying attention to the clock. Most of us have a clock around us at some point, and we can get disoriented, and we move from one task to the next task. We come to class, we leave class, we go to the next event. So we're not really interested in, we're focused more on the task. What do we have to get done? We're going to do that, and then we're going to move on to the next item. I know that there's some talk about how we're multitasking in the United States now, but we're really not multitasking. We're still doing one thing at a time, and we might be doing half of it at this time and then moving on to something else for half the time. And so we're doing one task at a time, but we might be doing multiple things. When we talk in difference to that with the polychronic cultures, they pay attention to relational time, and that is that they might be involved in many simultaneous activities. So they might be negotiating, for example, with somebody in the marketplace, but they're not only negotiating for goods and services, but they're also building on relationships. So people and the relationship becomes more important than the task at hand. So when we look at some of the ones that are more relational in terms of their time orientation, some of the cultures would be the Arabic cultures, African, Latin American, Asian, and Mediterranean cultures. And so they might not pay attention so closely to the clock like we do. And so if they're having a nice meal with somebody, and it might be a business meal, they will continue to talk to that person until their business is finished. And so they're not going to say, oh my gosh, I have a meeting at 1 o'clock, and jump up and run out on the person that they're having lunch with. If you were at a university, you might find that if you walked into a professor's office and had a question, they might take a lot more time with you instead of rushing off to class. Here, if you run into a professor just as they're leaving for class, they probably won't give you the time of day and just tell you to come back later because they're on their way to class. But in other cultures, a person in that relationship development is much more important than the task at hand. And so we might be involved in a task, but we're also involved in relationship building. Again, with the time orientation, we can always ask somebody, if we're in a particular culture, what their time orientation is. I can remember when I first arrived here, we had an international conference and they had a dinner. And I got down there on time, probably about 5 minutes before the dinner was supposed to be served. And I walked into an empty dining hall, and there was nobody around except one of the deans from another college. And then our dean walked in, and we just sort of sat there wondering where everybody else was. About 15-20 minutes later, everybody else walked in. They had been at an opening talk, and they got to talking about some ideas, then that was more important than rushing to dinner. And they weren't on the time clock. And one of our Spanish professors, when she sat down at the table with us, she had said in Spanish that they were on Latino time. And so that was a real difference, is to remember that sometimes when you're traveling, you can't always assume that they're on the same time as we are. The Bahamas is another real good example. The Caribbean cultures are more polychronic as well. And it's fun to watch if you go out to dinner in some of these places and watch the other Americans, and their faces are getting redder and redder because they're not being served, and they're angry because it's so poor, the service is so poor. So it's really fun to watch that, but if you're aware of that, then you can relax a little bit and enjoy the company that's at your table, and to remember that you're on vacation and you have no real important place to go anyway. Another area of real importance for us to understand, and I think that we've been getting at a little bit of this as we've talked about our statuses and roles, is the statuses that we occupy within a particular culture. And when we think about our statuses, that's how we're tied to our society. It's our positions within a particular society, whether we be professors or students, mothers or fathers, consumers. Those are all of our statuses. And you could probably sit down and write a list of all the statuses that you occupy. But we also know each of those statuses that we occupy have particular roles that are associated with them. So for example, my role of professor might be to be in class, to grade papers, to be a little bit smart. So we have particular ideas and expectations about people who hold particular statuses. In these roles and how we expect people to behave in particular statuses are culture bound and determined by the community at large. And if we think about Hofstede and his ideas about power distance and the femininity and masculinity and his dimensions, we know that people are going to behave differently. And if we're in a very structured society, how we expect people of a particular status to behave is going to be pretty set. There won't be as much variation in terms of the way a mother is, for example, or the way the father role is played, or the way management roles are played. They'll be a lot more structured than what we might find in a more individualistic culture, where we have a lot more flexibility that we can select between 3, 4, 5, 6 different management styles. We have a little bit more flexibility. The point here is that we are all socialized into our roles, and we are socialized on how we're supposed to interact with people in different roles or statuses. And when these behavioral patterns are internalized, we say that they've become institutionalized, so they become a part of our culture in the way that we interact with other people. Just to give you an example of this, when you see a police car out on the highway, and it doesn't matter where they are, you will see everybody slow down, because we all know that the police officers could possibly give us a ticket. And so everybody automatically slows down, and then the traffic gets all backed up and people get irritated because the traffic's backed up. And it doesn't matter if there's a barrier between you and the other cop. It's an automatic response that we do. And so that just shows that our knowledge of the police is institutionalized, and we expect them to behave in particular ways. Most people are going to conform to the expected and shared norms of our society and the shared ideas about how people in particular statuses are supposed to behave. And we make judgments all the time about appropriate and inappropriate behavior for those who occupy certain statuses. Certainly my classes would probably call Central Psych if I came in week after week and got up on the table and did a striptease. They certainly wouldn't believe that that was an appropriate role for a professor of sociology. If I was teaching exotic dancing, that might be appropriate, but for a college professor teaching sociology or chemistry or a lot of other fields, that would not be appropriate. And so we are making judgments on a daily basis on how people are performing in their particular statuses and roles. And we take these assumptions as we travel, and this is where we're going to find a lot of trouble, because we're making assumptions every day about how a police officer is supposed to behave. So if we go to another country and we interact with the police officer in the same way as we interact with the police officer here in the United States, we might end up in jail because we didn't bribe them. And so it's important for us to remember that there are certain expectations that people in different countries have about people who occupy particular statuses and how we're supposed to interact with them based on our status and our relation to them. I can remember when I went to Barbados and we were trying to find that nice bottle of Coca-Cola to go with our nice Barbadian rum. And we got into that grocery store, and we're a grocery store shopper. And we go in and get in line behind this woman who still appears to us to be shopping, and so we went ahead of her, and she came back yelling and screaming at us because we had cut in front of her in line. And we didn't think that we had done anything wrong because we were grocery shoppers here in the United States, and we know, as we've interacted with other people here in the United States, that they would have just assumed that we would go ahead of them and pay for our stuff. But in Barbados, that was considered rude. We had cut in front of her in line. And so it's not going to be the big things that we're going to notice. It's going to be these littler things as we occupy particular statuses in different countries, and then we interact incorrectly based on that status or our assumptions from the United States that we have about how people in that status is supposed to perform. There's two very important status and role areas that are associated with the family and sex and gender roles, and it becomes important for us to identify that. We know that when we look at more individualistic versus more collectivist cultures, for example, family has many culturally determined boundaries placed on it. In a individualistic culture, you might see more nuclear versus more of the extended family network. And we have a real big difference in terms of how we interact with our family members. If we are, for example, dating an individual and we're here in the United States, we might just introduce that individual to our parents. We would not introduce that person to our uncles and aunts and grandmothers and grandparents until we were probably a little bit more along within the relationship. But within the extended family, we would find difference here. When the emphasis is more on extended family, you would meet everybody and everybody has to approve your choice, fun or not. We also find differences in the family in terms of respect of members by age and sex. Sometimes when we look at China, for example, we know that the male child, the firstborn, is considered the most respected member for a lot of reasons. And I was on a recent trip to where it was. That was outside of LA, actually. I went and we were talking with a couple people from China, and they were remarking how, the male was remarking how he did not know his grandmother's maiden name. And he only knew her by, first grandmother or grandmother of, of me. And the woman related that she understood that, and that she was referred to as the oldest son's oldest sister. And that was her title. She was never addressed other than the oldest son's name, eldest sister. So it's a real, and that's even occurs today. So it's really important for us to remember that there are differences in terms of what different members of the family are able to do or not able to do, and that will vary, again, by culture. The way we view children, too, what is their role, and what do we have in terms of expecting our children to behave in particular ways? And for a lot of children here in the United States, we're very oriented towards the child, and they're catered to, and we don't find it unusual for us to see children in nicer restaurants. If we were in Europe, you would probably find that to be offensive. Canada, it was interesting when I was up in Canada, Windsor, right across from Detroit. And one of the ways that they handled children in the nicer restaurants were to make them smoking restaurants. And children under 12, I think, were not allowed to go into any restaurants that were smoking. So I thought that that was an interesting way to curtail the children. And the other differences between males and females, and how males versus females are looked upon in the culture. And when we think about how we have intimate relations, I think that that's a special area that needs a little bit of attention in terms of appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Again, that's getting at some of the rules of regulating sexual behavior within a culture. In Mexico, for example, we might find that in order for a female to be able to go out with people, she has to be with other family members. And a male would approach the male escort of the female, the male family member, in order to ask her to dance and so on and so forth. And there's also a big distinction between traditional versus modern roles for men and women. And when we look cross-culturally, certainly American women from the United States are much more modern in their roles and for expectations for women than we would find in a lot of other cultures. And a lot of us get offended by the treatment of women in some of the Arabic countries, for example. I know one of my students talked about her time in the military and serving in Saudi Arabia and how she had to cover her head and she could not talk to any males. If she went to the marketplace, she had to go with another male. She couldn't drive. So there's real differences in the way that men and women are viewed throughout the world. And when we lose status as we travel, we can get very offended very easily. And so we have to keep in mind that there are ways that other societies do these things, and there are different expectations for men and women, and you need to be aware of them as you travel as well.